My friend's mom smiled at me and said, "You look stronger than him," and something in me shifted. The first time I walked into my friend's house after a long break, I felt that familiar mix of comfort and subtle awkwardness. I'd known his mom for years, but adult interactions with her always carried a strange new weight. She wasn't just my friend's mother anymore. She was a woman with her own presence, confidence, and quiet authority that I hadn't fully noticed as a teenager. She greeted me with her usual warmth, the kind that made you feel both welcomed and slightly observed. The faint scent of her perfume, something soft and floral, reached me before I even saw her face. It was not overpowering, just enough to linger in the air like an invisible signature. Her eyes, a calm mixture of humor and curiosity, crinkled at the corners when she smiled, and I felt my chest tighten for reasons I didn't want to admit. "Wow, you've grown," she said lightly, stepping forward to shake my hand. Her grip was firm and sure, just enough to make me aware of the difference between the boy I once was and the man I was trying to become. I smiled, a little embarrassed, fumbling for words, because somehow, these simple gestures carried more weight than they should. We moved into the living room where my friend had left us alone for a few minutes while running an errand. She sat on the edge of the couch, casually crossing her legs, and gestured for me to take the armchair across from her. I could hear the faint hum of a ceiling fan and the distant chirping of birds outside, ordinary background sounds, but today they felt like part of a stage, highlighting something subtle that was happening between us. And then she said it. Out of nowhere, casually, with a playful tone that made me freeze for a second. "You look stronger than him." She tilted her head slightly, eyes twinkling with mischief, glancing toward the hallway where my friend had disappeared. I choked back a laugh, unsure if she was joking or observing something she hadn't meant to say aloud. There was a pause, that tiny electric pause, where the air seemed to thicken around us. Her words were innocent enough on the surface, but there was something in the way she smiled afterward, subtle yet charged, that made my heart skip. I tried to mask it with a cough, forcing my hands to remain where they were instead of tightening into fists out of nervous energy. It wasn't just the comment. It was how she said it, soft, deliberate, and with just a hint of knowing. It caught me off guard, not in a physical way, but in a way that made me hyper-aware of every gesture, every line of her face, the warmth of her presence in the room. I realized I was noticing details I'd never considered before. The gentle curve of her shoulders, the calm steadiness in her voice, the way her laughter seemed to fill the space without trying. As I sat there, smiling awkwardly, I felt something unfamiliar, a subtle curiosity, a flicker of admiration, and yes, a faint, hesitant pull. Something had shifted in that moment, something quiet but undeniable, and I didn't know yet if I was ready to explore it. It was only a comment, a smile, a simple observation. And yet it lingered in my mind far longer than it should have, a seed of tension, a quiet spark that would grow slowly, like an ember in the background, waiting for the right moment to flare. A few days after that first encounter, I found myself back at my friend's house, this time helping with some small household chores. It was supposed to be casual, me carrying groceries, fixing a loose cabinet hinge, but somehow, every ordinary task felt charged with a subtle, unspoken energy. She was there, naturally moving through the space, offering small suggestions in her calm, assured voice. "Careful with that," she said once, lightly brushing my shoulder as she guided me to hold a bag correctly. The touch was fleeting, almost accidental, yet it left a faint warmth lingering on my skin. I caught myself looking at her longer than necessary, noting how her posture was effortlessly graceful, how her movements had the kind of quiet confidence that came from years of experience. We worked side by side in the kitchen, the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the window, painting the room in a soft golden glow. The smell of freshly baked bread from earlier lingered in the air, mingling with the subtle floral note of her perfume. Each time I glanced at her, I noticed details I had missed before. The way her fingers moved delicately when she adjusted a misplaced napkin, the faint crease of concentration between her brows, the softness of her smile when she realized she was watching me fumble with a jar. And then it happened again, one of those fleeting moments where time seemed to pause. Our eyes met across the counter, lingering just a beat too long. There was nothing overt, nothing spoken, but in that moment, I felt a quiet pull, an electric charge that threaded between us like a fragile wire, humming softly. She didn't look away immediately. Instead, she held my gaze, her expression calm yet teasing, as if silently acknowledging that we were both aware of something delicate developing between us. The tension wasn't dramatic or urgent, it was slow, almost imperceptible, like a subtle current beneath the surface. I felt my heart pick up slightly, my hands more conscious of the space they occupied, the way I moved. I realized I was acutely aware of every small gesture she made, the brush of her hair behind her ear, the soft laugh she allowed herself when I fumbled, the way her eyes followed me with a curious warmth. I caught myself imagining things I shouldn't, not inappropriate, but just possibilities. The way a longer glance might feel, the brush of her hand lingering a second too long, the comfort of being near someone who saw you in a way no one else did. It was confusing, intoxicating, and exhilarating all at once. By the time my friend returned home, I was acutely aware that something had shifted. It wasn't a confession or a declaration, it was far subtler than that. It was a sense of connection, of tension held in glances and gestures, a quiet acknowledgement of attraction neither of us dared name yet. As I left that afternoon, the sunlight fading behind me, I realized that these small, almost accidental moments, the touches, the smiles, the lingering eyes, were weaving themselves into my thoughts. I was no longer just helping a friend or being polite. I was noticing her, truly noticing her, and the awareness carried a thrill I hadn't expected. It was slow. It was gentle. But it was real, a quiet spark waiting to grow, one glance, one touch, one fleeting smile at a time. A few days later, I found myself lingering at my friend's house longer than I had intended. My friend had stepped out for a quick errand, leaving us alone together. The air felt different that day, quieter, more intimate, as if the room itself was waiting for something to unfold. She had a way of moving that made ordinary spaces feel charged, her presence grounding yet subtly electrifying. We sat at the kitchen table with mugs of steaming coffee, the scent rich and slightly bitter, mingling with the soft floral trace of her perfume. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs casually, but there was a softness in her eyes that drew me in. For the first time, it felt like we weren't just occupying the same room. We were talking, really talking, in a way that blurred the lines of familiarity and intrigue. The conversation started lightly, a joke about my clumsiness when I tried to lift a heavy box, a comment on the weather, the way the sunlight fell across the countertop. But gradually, it drifted toward more personal territory. She shared a story about a challenge she had faced recently, her voice steady yet tinged with vulnerability. I listened, leaning forward slightly, aware of the subtle warmth of her presence, the way her hands rested near mine on the table. There was a moment when she hesitated, looking down at her mug, and I noticed the slight quiver in her fingers. I felt a sudden, protective instinct, a desire to reach across the table, to brush her hand gently, to offer comfort in a way words could not. Instead, I simply nodded, letting my attentiveness speak for me, feeling the tension in the room thrum like an undercurrent. She noticed my focus, I realized, because she lifted her gaze and met mine. The way her eyes held mine was not casual. There was recognition there, a quiet acknowledgement that this connection, fleeting as it might be, was real. For a heartbeat, neither of us spoke. The sound of the coffee warming in our mugs, the hum of the refrigerator, even the distant chirping outside, seemed amplified, like the world had slowed just for us. We laughed softly at an offhand comment, a laugh that felt unplanned yet comforting, lingering in the space between us. I caught myself studying the little details I hadn't noticed before, the curve of her smile, the way her hair framed her face, the gentle tilt of her head when she listened. Every gesture seemed deliberate, yet natural, a combination that pulled me in without effort. When I spoke, it was simple, sincere. I shared a small piece of my own struggle, something I rarely admitted even to close friends. She listened, leaning slightly closer, her shoulder brushing mine in a subtle, fleeting contact that made my chest tighten. I realized I felt safe admitting things to her, yet simultaneously, a tension stirred beneath that safety, the unspoken possibility of something more. By the time my friend returned, I was acutely aware that our conversation had shifted something fundamental. We weren't just sharing words, we had shared a space of vulnerability, a quiet intimacy that transcended age, expectation, and convention. That day, I left with a sense of connection that lingered in my chest, a quiet ember, glowing steadily, promising more if only we allowed it. It was honest. It was tender. And it was the moment I realized that this slow, careful bond was beginning to deepen, a subtle romance forming not through grand gestures, but through attention, presence, and shared vulnerability. It was another quiet afternoon when I found myself at my friend's house again, this time helping her in the garden. The sun was low in the sky, casting a warm golden light across the yard, and the faint scent of freshly cut grass mingled with the subtle perfume she always wore. I could feel the gentle warmth of the day seeping into my skin, but it was her presence that made the air feel alive, electric in a subtle, unspoken way. We moved side by side, carrying potted plants and arranging them in the flower beds. She guided me gently, her hand brushing against mine as she pointed out the best spot for a particular plant. The contact was fleeting, nothing deliberate, yet it left a lingering warmth on my skin, a memory of touch that I couldn't shake. My heart picked up without warning, my mind suddenly hyper-aware of every movement, every glance, every slight curve of her body as she bent to adjust a plant. We laughed together at a small mishap. I had dropped a small bag of soil, and she shook her head, smiling in that quiet, amused way that always caught me off guard. "You always manage to make a mess," she teased, but there was no harshness, only warmth. I handed her another tool, and as our hands brushed again, I felt that spark, not shocking or urgent, just a gentle acknowledgement that we were both aware of something delicate forming between us. Her laughter was soft, almost musical, and it seemed to linger in the space around us. I realized I was noticing more than just her actions, the tilt of her head when she smiled, the subtle curve of her cheek, the warmth of her eyes when she caught me looking. Each small gesture felt significant, amplified by my growing awareness of her presence and the tension that had been quietly building over the past few visits. At one point, she leaned slightly closer to reach a plant on a higher shelf, and our shoulders brushed again. I felt my chest tighten in a way I hadn't before, a mix of admiration, curiosity, and something else I wasn't ready to name. It wasn't overwhelming or rushed. It was subtle, gentle, a reminder that attraction didn't always need to announce itself loudly to be powerful. She caught me staring once, and instead of pulling away or laughing awkwardly, she held my gaze for a moment longer than necessary, her smile soft and knowing. That single look sent a thrill through me, not from desire alone, but from recognition. She saw me noticing her, and she seemed to accept it without question, a quiet complicity forming between us. By the time we finished, I was aware of how different our interactions had become. It wasn't just friendship anymore, it was something layered and nuanced, growing from shared moments and small touches into a subtle, almost unspoken intimacy. Even the simple act of handing each other tools, brushing past in narrow spaces, laughing at minor accidents, each one felt like a thread weaving us closer together, slowly, deliberately, beautifully. As I left that evening, the golden light fading into a soft dusk, I realized that the small acts, touches, glances, laughter, and shared space were creating a language of their own. One that didn't need words to convey curiosity, warmth, or even the quiet stirrings of something more. It was slow. It was deliberate. And it was, without question, real. It was one of those rare evenings when the house felt almost impossibly quiet, the kind of stillness that makes every creak of a floorboard and every distant sound seem amplified. My friend was out, leaving me alone with her again, and the tension in the room felt heavier than before, charged with all the unspoken words, lingering glances, and tiny touches that had accumulated over the past weeks. We were in the living room, seated across from each other on opposite couches, the warm glow of a single lamp casting soft shadows. Outside, The faint rustle of leaves in the wind added a gentle rhythm to the silence. She sipped her tea slowly, letting her gaze drift over me as if she were trying to read something I wasn't even aware I was projecting. I felt exposed in the most unexpected way, yet safe. The paradox made my heart pound, my palms a little clammy. A sudden moment of vulnerability broke the quiet. She laughed softly at something I said, and the laugh was so tender, so human, that I couldn't help but lean slightly forward. Our shoulders brushed, and for a heartbeat, the room shrank to the space between us. The contact wasn't dramatic, but it sent a jolt through me, a sharp awareness of how much I wanted to close that gap, to stay in that proximity just a little longer. Her voice, calm and steady, carried more weight that evening. She shared a story about a regret, a choice she'd made years ago, speaking openly about emotions she rarely revealed to anyone. I listened, my focus entirely on her, the soft rise and fall of her chest, the way her fingers wrapped around the mug, the subtle quiver when she mentioned something particularly painful. I wanted to reach out to comfort her, yet a social and internal barrier held me back, reminding me of the boundaries we were skirting merely by being present in this charged, private moment. And then our eyes met, long, deliberate, and unflinching. There was no need for words. The tension that had been simmering over weeks boiled just enough to be undeniable. I could feel it in the warmth of her glance, in the quiet power of her smile that seemed to suggest she knew exactly how I felt without me saying a thing. My pulse quickened, my chest tightened, and I realized that this was the moment where the slow burn attraction, the subtle tension, the fleeting touches, the lingering looks demanded recognition. I wanted to speak, to confess even a fraction of what I was feeling, but fear and hesitation clenched my throat. Yet, even in silence, there was an understanding between us. Every micro-expression, every shift in posture, every brush of her hand across mine, whether intentional or accidental, communicated something that words could not. By the time the evening wound down, the emotional peak had left us both aware of what was growing between us. There was a longing in her eyes, and a hesitant desire mirrored in mine. We weren't acting on it yet, but the realization of mutual attraction hung in the air, heavy and undeniable, like the charged calm before a storm. Walking out that night, I felt a mix of exhilaration and anxiety. The slow burn tension had reached its first crescendo, leaving me acutely aware of her presence in my thoughts. It wasn't impulsive desire, it was a careful, consuming awareness, the kind that makes ordinary moments feel monumental and small touches feel monumental. And I knew, with a clarity I hadn't expected, that everything was about to change. The evening air was cool when I arrived at my friend's house again, carrying a quiet sense of anticipation I couldn't quite shake. There was something about the rhythm of our meetings, the lingering glances, the casual touches, the slow unfolding of unspoken emotions, that made each visit feel like stepping into a private world. Tonight, though, it felt heavier, more urgent, as if everything that had been simmering between us for weeks was waiting for acknowledgement. We ended up in the kitchen, preparing a simple meal together. The soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional clink of utensils created a comforting backdrop, yet my awareness of her presence was acute. She moved gracefully around the room, the light catching the highlights in her hair, the gentle sway of her movements mesmerizing in their ease. Each small gesture, her hand brushing mine as she passed a bowl, the tilt of her head when she laughed at my joke, carried the subtle charge of intimacy that had been building since our first encounter. At one point, we found ourselves standing side by side, close enough that the warmth of her body brushed against mine. The proximity made my chest tighten, a mix of nervousness and longing I could no longer ignore. I wanted to reach out, to let her know how deeply I had come to care, how much her presence had become a part of my thoughts, but I hesitated, acutely aware of the boundaries we had skirted for so long. Then, almost imperceptibly, she looked at me, really looked, and smiled, a soft, knowing curve of her lips that seemed to invite honesty without demanding it. The world around us faded, leaving only the quiet tension between us. I took a slow breath, trying to steady the fluttering in my chest. Words, simple and sincere, finally came. I really enjoy being with you, I said, my voice low but steady. More than I ever expected. I think I've started to care about you, more than I should. Her smile widened slightly, gentle and reassuring, yet her eyes held a depth that made my heart skip. There was no immediate laughter, no playful deflection, only presence, understanding, and a quiet acknowledgement of shared feeling. She reached out, resting a hand lightly on my forearm. The touch was brief, but it sent a warmth rippling through me, a silent confirmation that she had felt it too, the growing connection, the tender pull we had both tried to ignore. We lingered in that space for a moment, the unspoken weight of weeks of subtle tension finally given a voice. There was relief, yes, but also something more, a gentle, simmering excitement that came from knowing the feelings were mutual, even if the path forward remained uncertain. I realized then that confession didn't need fireworks or dramatic gestures. Sometimes it was in the quiet, careful honesty of a single sentence, spoken with sincerity, met with a smile that said, "I see you too." By the time the evening ended, the atmosphere had shifted. We weren't just aware of each other anymore. We were conscious of the bond forming, a delicate yet undeniable bridge of emotion. That night, as I left the house, I carried with me the warmth of her hand on mine, the softness of her smile, and the exhilarating awareness that something significant had begun, a slow, deliberate romance built on honesty, attention, and the quiet courage to admit what the heart had long suspected. It was confession. It was acknowledgement. And it was beautiful in its subtle, unhurried truth. The last evening I spent at my friend's house carried a weight I could feel in the back of my chest, a mixture of anticipation, nervousness, and quiet joy. The weeks of subtle touches, lingering glances, and whispered confessions had built toward this moment, and now it felt as though everything was finally allowed to breathe, to exist openly without the shadow of hesitation. We sat together on the couch, the room softly lit by the warm glow of a single lamp. Outside, the evening had settled into a gentle hush, distant traffic, the faint rustle of leaves in the wind, and the occasional chirp of a night bird created a serene backdrop. But none of that mattered as much as her presence beside me, the comforting warmth radiating from her, the softness in her gaze that made my pulse quicken even in the absence of grand gestures. Our hands met almost naturally, resting together in quiet solidarity. Her touch was light yet grounding, a gentle affirmation that we had crossed a threshold from curiosity to something real, tangible, and emotionally profound. There was no urgency, no expectation, just a steady, mutual acknowledgement of the bond we had nurtured slowly, deliberately, through patience and understanding. We spoke softly, reminiscing about small moments that had defined our connection, the casual brush of her hand as she guided me in the kitchen, our lingering eye contact in the living room, the shared laughter over minor mishaps. Each memory held a subtle charge, a reminder of how far we had come and how deeply we had come to care for one another without ever forcing the pace. Her laughter, warm and effortless, filled the room and made me acutely aware of how much I had come to crave this quiet companionship. Then, in a moment that felt suspended in time, she turned toward me, her eyes reflecting the soft glow of the lamp. "I'm glad we found this. Whatever it is," she said, her voice steady yet tender. I smiled, feeling a rush of relief and gratitude. "Me too," I replied, my fingers tightening slightly around hers. "It feels like everything I didn't realize I was waiting for has finally arrived." There was a pause, but it was comfortable, filled with mutual understanding. We didn't need words to articulate the layers of emotion, the admiration, the affection, the respect, and the quiet thrill of connection that had grown between us. Our closeness was more than romantic attraction. It was a recognition of shared humanity, of trust, of subtle but undeniable desire tempered by patience and care. Finally, we leaned slightly toward each other, sharing a brief, tender hug, one that lingered just long enough to communicate everything words could not. It was gentle, YouTube safe, yet charged with the warmth of intimacy, her head resting momentarily on my shoulder, my arms lightly encircling her, the faint scent of her perfume enveloping me. In that embrace, I felt the culmination of all the slow, patient moments that had led to this point, the journey of noticing, of care, of quiet longing now fully acknowledged. As I left that night, walking through the softly lit streets, I carried the memory of her hand in mine, the lingering warmth of her touch, and the certainty that what had begun would continue to grow. We had arrived at a resolution, not rushed, not forced, but earned through time, patience, and the courage to let our feelings unfold naturally. It was together, tender, and secure. And in that quiet, deliberate embrace of emotion, I realized that slow-burn love, when nurtured with honesty and care, could be more powerful and enduring than any sudden, fleeting passion.